Why are people dumber today than they were, say, 100 years ago? Could it be that it is nothing to do with finance? It is nothing to do with how good a teacher is, but everything to do with the system that is used. A system used to keep the masses ignorant and dumbed down. A system of control. The classical Christian education that dominated Western civilization from the fall of Rome in 476 AD to the Age of Enlightenment was called the Trivium. It was an education focusing on training students in 7 liberal arts. These 7 liberal arts were divided into the Trivium, which is arts of language, and the Quadrium, arts of numbers. There were 3 Trivium arts, which is what the word trivium means. It means 3 roads. These were grammar, logic, sometimes called dialectic, and rhetoric. There were 4 quadrivium arts, quadrivium meaning 4 roads. Harmonics, which was music. Music in those days was considered to be part of mathematics. Astronomy, geometry, and arithmetic. The idea was that these roads would lead the student to wisdom and virtue. The Trivium education centered on the idea that understanding language, learning to think well, and learning to communicate well should be high priorities for the well-educated student. It spent much time training students in the grammar of their own language and of foreign languages, so they understood the structure of language themselves. The student must also learn to use language to articulate logical thoughts. They must practice the skill of forming logical arguments and of dissecting the logical arguments of others, looking for fallacies and bad reasoning. This is the art of rhetoric. They were expected to write persuasive essays, research papers, and original poems and short stories, and to engage in policy and debates. In conclusion, the goal was to produce students who could read well, think well, and express themselves well. Now let us look at the history of education in North America. The very first education law was written by the Puritans of the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1647. The Old Deluder Act required that any community reaching a population of 50 families hired a teacher. When a community grew to 100 households, they were then to build a school building. The Puritans understood the need for literacy, particularly to enable a person to read the scriptures for themselves, in order to withstand the deluder, the devil. The Deluder Act of 1647 predated the founding of America as a nation by more than 100 years. So it was obviously not an example of national government involvement in education. It was born out of the needs of the local families, and it was to teach the basic skill of reading. While some of the founding fathers of America attended private school, most of them were schooled at home, either by their parents or by a private tutor, or even being self-taught. Benjamin Franklin, for example, started school at the age of 8, came home at the age of 10 to assist in his father's business, and he learnt mostly from his father, who had very little or no formal schooling himself. George Washington attended school for only 2 years, then taught himself. Thomas Jefferson had a private tutor. This was the early American pattern. School attendance was voluntary and funded mainly privately or by charity. All this was prior to the rise of an organised school system in America. Yet, according to the census of 1840, 90% of white adults were literate, and in 1860 that number had risen to 94%. By comparison, a 1993 US Department of Education study showed that only 50% of American adults were moderately literate. In 1836, Edward Everett was made Massachusetts state governor and set out to make his state's education system after the Prussian model. As president of the Senate, Horace Mann, who would later be known as the father of American public education, led the passage of a new law that Everett wanted to allow him to appoint a state school board. This effectively took control of local schools from local officials and put them in the hands of the state. Everett then appointed Mann as the secretary of the new Massachusetts State School Board. During the next 30 years or so, a whole line of American dignitaries came to Germany to earn degrees, Horace Mann amongst them. Those who earned degrees in Germany came back to America and staffed all the major universities. It was also introduced into the northern half of the continent by the Canadian Superintendent of Schools, Egerton Ryerson. To determine who would be the teachers and what the teachers would believe in the classroom, Mann concentrated on teacher colleges called normal schools. James G. Carter, in an 1825 pamphlet, called the first normal school at Lexington, Massachusetts, quote, an engine to sway the public sentiment, the public morals, and the public religion, more powerful than any other in the possession of the government, unquote. Instead of using the system called phonics to sound out a word, the Prussian model used the look-see method, recognizing words and even whole sentences by the way they looked rather than learning to sound them out. And although literacy took a nosedive, it was adopted throughout the nation. Horace Mann's sister, Elizabeth Peabody of the Peabody Foundation, saw to it that after the Civil War, the Prussian system taught in the northern states was integrated into the conquered South between 1865 and 1918. By 1900, all the PhDs in the United States were trained in Prussia. By then, most of the compulsory schooling laws that had been implemented, which had started with Horace Mann, had been passed, and from then on, every American child grew up under the Prussian system. So what is this Prussian education system that everyone thought was so amazing it had to be adopted throughout Europe and North America? Prussia is what we now call Germany. After the defeat of the Prussians by Napoleon at the Battle of Jena in 1806, it was decided that the reason why the battle was lost was that the Prussian soldiers were thinking for themselves on the battlefield instead of following orders. They were one of the first countries to introduce free and compulsory education. An 8-year schooling system was devised, where the state decided what was to be learnt and what the child was to think. Respect for authority and the ability to follow orders was paramount. Elite children destined for higher offices would attend private secondary schools, which the masses had no access to. They were destined for the workplace. The whole purpose of the system was to instill loyalty to the crown and to train people for the workplace, the military, and bureaucracy. and to do this they had to squeeze out individual thought from the masses. In modern terms, this is pledge allegiance to the flag and check your brain in at the door. Critical thinking had to be done away with. An influence on this system was Prussian philosopher Johann Gottlieb Fichte, who combined John Locke's view that children were a blank slate and Rousseau's ideas on how to write on that slate to develop a philosophy that greatly influenced the Prussian education system, an education system that was considered scientific in nature. Fichte is quoted as saying, "The schools must fashion the person, and fashion him in such a way that he simply cannot will otherwise than what you wish him to will. Education should aim at destroying free will, so that after pupils are thus schooled, they will be incapable throughout the rest of their lives of thinking or acting otherwise than as their schoolmasters would have wished." When the technique has been perfected, every government that has been in charge of education for more than one generation will be able to control its subjects securely without the need of armies or policemen. In 1807, in a Berlin occupied by Napoleon, Johann Fichte gave a series of famous addresses to the German nation. He spoke of the superiority of the German people above all others. His speeches were the catalyst for the Prussian education system and also German nationalism. In other earlier works, he called the Jews a state within a state that would undermine the German nation, and openly expressed a desire to expel the Jews from Germany. Fichte had a deep influence on the rise of the Third Reich, and continues to be deemed the spiritual father of modern neo-Nazism. Historians reflect that one of the reasons that allowed a man like Hitler to rise to power was that the German people were bred from birth to respect authority above all else and accept it without question. The Prussian education system adopted by most of Europe and North America is about control and brainwashing.